Okay.
Teach us.
Okay, so this section about davening is about time constraints. So I'm just going to, I've got notes here. I'm going to add a little bit. So it says the best time to daven. When they talk about davening, they usually refer to shacharit. Most of the time, 95% of the time, let's say. So they say the best time to daven is actually nates, which is just before sunrise. That's the most optimal time to daven. And you can begin your tefillah, and they say to reach the time when you actually start Shemona Israel at sunrise. So you can do the brachot before, and Pesukei the Zimra, and the brachos of the Shema and the Shema. And if you arrive at the optimal time, optimally at sunrise, then it's to do Shemona Israel. That's what they say. And it says it's based on a posuk in Tehillim. And what it says, in Tehillim, they will fear you while the sun rises. It says, if one does not daven at sunrise, he may daven until the end of the 4th hour of the day. That comes from Orach HaChaim. And it says in this situation, the only limitation that he must take care not to recite a bracha on tzitzit, talis, tefillin before Kedei Sheyakir. I don't know what that means. Keday Sheyakir. Because you can only daven until a certain time of day, shachrit. If you don't, you miss the time and you can't actually daven. You miss the boat. And it says the reason for this, not to recite a bracha on tzitzit talis tefillin before Kedei Sheyakir, is that the time for these mitzvahs does not begin until sunrise. So it also depends on if you need to travel somewhere and you just won't have time to go to daven, then there are leniencies, but one shouldn't try daven too early. I don't think that applies to us most of the time. But there is a schut for davening shachrit as early as possible, which is nates. Okay, I'll continue next time with this.
Stop, Kevin. Thank you.
Kevin, thanks, mate. Just one question I had for you is that in Gemara Brachos it talks about the time that you have to discern the techelet color. In other words, there has to be enough light to determine whether or not it's
the blue. You could distinguish the blue against the white.
Against the white, and there has to be enough sunrise. So how does that correspond with what you're saying, which seems a contradiction?
No, it's and then also if you can notice somebody in the distance without using electric light. If you see someone outdoors,
you can recognize
and you can distinguish them. Then it's okay. Then you can daven. Yeah.
Great. So how does that correlate?
Or recognize them? Yeah.
You can start a bit earlier. Is that only if you only?
Depends on there are leniency, because otherwise it's just not going to be possible. It's the point is people want to daven, the intention is there. That's the main thing also.
That is the main thing. All right, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, guys. Yeah. I'm going to send a new link and then join us with the Gemara share. But when we could join with the Gemara share, let's get straight into the share. Right?
Yeah,
I'm sending a new link if you now. Start to record. Okay, just a quick bit of repetition. 58b3. Sorry, 58b3. The Gemara records an incident. There was a certain man who cut down his fellow's palm tree, and the damager came before the exile ark for judgment. An exile ark are judges out of Eretz Israel, and he asked the exile ark to judge the case between himself and the fellow, the damager and the damaged party. And the judge said, I myself have seen that the tree was cut down, and it was one of 3 palm trees that stood in one place. And together they were worth 100 zuz. Therefore, go give the owner 33 1/3 zuz. In other words, 1/3 of the amount. And the damager said, Why do I have to be involved with the judge who imposes Persian law? He went before Rav Nachman for judgment, and Rav Nachman said to him, the tree is evaluated in relation to 60 trees. So Rava disagrees with Rav Nachman's ruling, because he said that where one's property caused damage, he can understand that there is a leniency of 1 to 60 in terms of ratio. But where the person himself caused the damage, the method of appraisal, which benefits the damage, is only used of the leniency of your property causing damage, not when the person himself did the damage by his own hands. Okay, so Rava's opinion is challenged by whom? A buyer, because a buyer said, look, let's study this. If we look at the reason for asserting that you don't use this method of appraisal, where the person himself caused the damage, it's based on that which was taught in the following brisa. If one destroys his fellow's vineyard when its fruit is budding, we view how much the vineyard was worth before the damage and how much it was worth afterwards, and the damager pays the difference. Now, the brisa doesn't say that the devastated area is assessed in relation to the vineyard 60 times larger. So the mission supports Rava's view so far, that one who damages with his own hands must pay the full independent value of the damaged property. But that's not a valid proof, because in connection with damage caused by one's animal itself, the brisa that followed that stated in the same manner. In other words, it made the same omission, for it was taught that if an animal severed a young tree that belonged to another, Rav Yose reports that those who promulgated decrees in Jerusalem, because knasim, penalties, were only allowed in Eretz Israel, said that the minimum you could pay for a tree in its first year is 2 manos, miles of silver, and for a tree in its second year, you pay 4 miles of silver. That's the minimum. So the brisa continues, if it ate newly sprouted grain, in other words, it was still green, the stalks, then Rav Yose HaGlili says we judge the loss by what remains in that field. What do we mean? Is that we wait until the rest of the field is ready to be harvested, and then we note how much the field is worth at that time. That's what Rashi says. Because you're using that value as your guide, you reckon the amount that the devastated area would have been worth at harvest time, had it been allowed to grow. So that's the amount that the damager must pay, although the damage occurred when the grain was unripe. Now, according to the sages, they don't view it that way. They say, we view how much the land was worth before the damage occurred and how much the land is worth afterwards, and the damager pays the difference. In other words, we don't assess potential value of damaged grain, but only what it was worth when it was damaged. And they view that way also when, for example, a calf is killed. We don't view it at what it would come to adulthood. But here it's a little different, because as far as the sages are concerned, that you don't assess potential value. It's different according to the issue that we have with Rav Yose HaGlili, because Rav Yose HaGlili says you don't know necessarily if the calf would have gone to adulthood, it could have died of disease, etc. But here in the case of the grain, you've seen the rest of the grain in the field get matured without any devastating pestilence, without any flooding, without any drought. And since you're able to tell the future retroactively by, once it is ripe, seeing what that value of land would have been lost had it ripened, you can take that into account. So it seems as though obviously the sages are more lenient. There is a case where Rav Yose HaGlili is more lenient. And when is that, guys? Just to test if you understood what we said last time. If you're retroactively working the current assessment of a ripened field in order to work out what the unripened produce would have been valued at harvest time, and take that amount and deducted it from the value of the field to see the loss of the damaged party, it seems that if it did come to fruition and the grain did ripen, it's more stringent than the sages. When will it be less stringent than the sages? That's what I'm testing you on. We did this the other day.
Yeah, I'll probably not. Oh gosh. It's so okay. So you're saying it's more stringent than the sages when you wait until fruition, right? That's the one method. But if you don't wait until fruition, it's more strict. If you make
That's not what I'm saying.
You're looking for less than.
That's
what is your
question? All right, I'll rephrase it. According to HaGlili, if you take the same circumstance, he says, listen, he sees budding or developing material as, in other words, let's take newly sprouted grain, okay? He's saying that it's not ripe yet, but we view it as though it had ripened and then assess the value when the rest of the field has reached maturation. Okay, so in that case, it's obviously much more stringent than the sages, because the sages say you can't work on future value or potential value. You take the value of the the underdeveloped grain at the time, and you pay the damages based on that. In which case, if we worked it according to Rav Yose HaGlili, would the damager pay less than the sages, according to Rav Yose HaGlili, using the future developmental method? Arthur, any ideas? All right, let me put you guys out of the misery. Arthur, are you WhatsApping or texting somebody? Okay.
Awkward angle this?
Awkward angle.
There we go. No, it's on my pillow, okay, and it keeps sliding down.
Okay.
I'm trying to rest it, otherwise I've got to hold it all the time. So
okay, fair
sliding,
enough.
so it keeps losing my face.
Fair enough.
Sorry.
No problem. I'm losing your face, Arthur. I'm just seeing the top. I'd like to see your whole face. That's it. Now I'm seeing you from here. I can't hear you. That's it. All right. Guys, what we're saying is as follows. Say there was a devastating pestilence. Then Rav Yose HaGlili is more lenient than the sages, because he would have said, listen, the field amounted to nothing. It was devastated. There were locusts. Therefore, we've seen that the unripe stalks that you would have paid for, that unripe state, you would have paid something for it. Now that the whole field amounted to no sort of successful harvest, you pay nothing, because we see that it didn't reach its potential. In fact, it wasn't worth anything. Only in that case is Rav Yose HaGlili more lenient than the sages. If things turn out right and the field ripens, then he's more stringent than the sages. Okay, so let's go on. That we've already done. So now what we're talking about is originally, let's look at the macro and micro context. A buyer is basically arguing with Rava, because Rava says that if you look at the issue, is that Rav Nachman turned around and said, look, we don't hold like Persian law. We pay the damage of your one tree, your one palm tree, in relation to 60 palm trees. And that's what Rav Nachman says. Whereas the exile ark turned around and says, no, there are 3 trees, only 3 trees. You damaged one. It was worth 100 zuz, paying 33 1/3. So Rav Nachman disagrees with the exile ark. And the reason that Rava disagrees with Rav Nachman is he said, look, the person themselves did the damage, not a person's property, the person's animal. And therefore, you can view it according to the fact that the damage should be actual damage and not in relation to 1 and 60. A buyer now disagrees with Rava and says, look, it's not the case. Because if you're saying that a person that does the damage themselves, that's the reason, I can agree with you, because the first part of the brisa where you base that on is correct. Because if a person destroys his fellow's vineyard when the fruit is budding, then we view it only in context to the damage of what it was worth before and what it was worth after, and the damager pays the difference, meaning you're only paying almost, it would seem, in and of its own plot of land damage context, and not in a field 60 times greater. So Abai is saying to Rav, I agree with you there, it does say that, but it says the same thing when it says that an animal damages or severs a young tree, is that you have to pay a minimum of 2 ma'os for the first year or 4 ma'os in the second year, which means it's not taken in context of 60 severed trees at all. It's taking it in a smaller context. So the fact that it says the same thing for animals as opposed to people, in other words, there's an omission of talking about the greater context of other fields. And since that omission is there in both the case of animal and people, it would seem that that's no proof to Rava. That's what Abaye says. So we've got that argument going on. Then we've got a different context of the argument going on, that it seems that it's talking about maybe there's a penalty or something that you pay for in terms of the maturation process. What do we mean? Is that something that is damaged before it's reached its full maturity is worth less than that which has achieved maturity. If you kill a calf, you don't pay as much as when it became a 400-pound heifer, because we take it at actual damage and not potential damage. But it seems here as though there is a diverting opinion, that when fruit is budding, you pay almost as though it's reached its fruition, or you certainly pay a penalty. The same thing if you sever a young tree. And then obviously we go into Rav Yosef HaGlili, who said if it ate newly sprouted grain, you pay as though it had reached the value at harvest time, at maturation. So far we're saying that there's another way to view it, not just the area in terms of when it was damaged, but how do you assess damage if the tree or the grain or the grapes are immature? Do you judge it as though it's worth nothing because it hasn't matured yet? Or do you pay a penalty because you've killed it before it's reached its potential? That's the other argument going on at the same time. So if we just look at it in terms of the greater context, if it ate newly sprouted grain, Rav Yose HaGlili says we judge the loss by what remains in that field. In other words, we wait for it to mature and then we see what the potential would have actualized at. But the sages say we don't assess potential value. We view how much the land was worth before the damage occurred and how much it's worth afterwards, and the damager pays the difference. Now, there's a third case. If the animal ate budding grapes, again, we're talking about things that haven't fully developed, right? And budding grapes is a term for it. It's known as smadar. So that refers to small grapes that begin to appear immediately after the vine blossoms have fallen off. I don't know if any of you have seen how chilies grow. Art, have you seen how chilies grow? So my dad's got a chili plant. There's a flower, and when that flower falls off, you have a little chili, and that develops. So it's the same thing with grapes, is that when the blossoms have fallen off, that's when the vine actually blossoms with what you call smother, which is almost these very, very tiny green pustules that occur. And where does this mention it? In Brachos 36b, in Kedushin 54b. Okay? So Rav Yehoshua says, we view them as though they were grapes ready to be picked, but the sages say we view how much the land was worth before the damage occurred and how much it's worth afterwards, and the damager pays the difference. So it seems like Rav Yehoshua holds like Rav Yose HaGlili, except Rabbi Yehoshua is talking about grapes, and Rav Yose HaGlili is talking about unripe grain. Does that make sense? But they both hold that if it's unripe, you treat it as though it's already been ripened in terms of value. And if you say it's ready to be picked, are you taking something that's ready to be picked in context of a larger field, yes or no? Or just in terms of that area that needs to be harvested? So that's one of the discussions that are going on. So I'll give you an example. So Rashi basically implies that Rabbi Yehoshua requires the damager to pay what the ripe grapes would cost in the market after being harvested. Okay? But according to other Rishonim, like for example, you've got the Maharsha, say that although Rav Yehoshua maintains that the damager must pay how much the land would be devalued at harvest time by the loss of ripe grapes. In other words, both are saying that you have to pay the higher amount in terms of the produce ripening, but the difference is if you take just those grapes in connection with that actual area of damage, of what it yielded in terms of produce at the marketplace, it's going to fetch a much higher rate than what ripened grapes would have yielded in an entire vineyard, or ripened grain in terms of what was missing in terms of a whole field. Does that make sense? Kev, have you got me or not? Arthur? Just explain it to me back, because if not, you need to explain it to me. Then I'm satisfied.
You want me or Arthur to try? Arthur, do you want to go first or should I go?
I think Arthur's doing something else hardly.
Okay, so
I'm just taking my medicine.
Okay, so you want me to, okay, let me try, Damon. So you're saying, okay, I might not say it in the same words the way you said it.
As long as you understand.
I know it's there's a value if the grapes are fully ripened, then it's obviously they can sell that, they can get the full value from them. If they're fully edible, fully consumable. If they're not, if they have the potential, then you can't realize if they're damaged, you can't at a certain point where they're not fully ripe, can't realize the full market value had they been fully ripe.
Okay, I'm saying that, but I'm saying something else now. What I'm saying now is as follows: is that there's an argument with the Rishonim on Rabbi Yehoshua. So some say Rabbi Yehoshua is saying that within the context of grapes, what we do is we view those grapes that were damaged at their market-related value having been picked, okay? Which then you're paying proper prices at like what food lovers market would buy it for, okay? You're paying a proper price. Whereas if you say that it's valued those grapes that have not developed yet as though they developed, but in context of the damage to the larger field. In other words, you've got a field of 60 times the damage. Let's just say 60, or at least that field, and a third of that field was destroyed. And you take those unripe grapes as though they've all ripened. You're paying more because you've counted them as having ripened, but you're still paying less than if you just take that cluster at what it would be valued at the market compared to a small part of your vineyard missing of ripe grapes in a field, in a vineyard of completely developed grapes. So in other words, they both talk about evaluating it at the ripened state, but one is in context to a field and one is in context to small amount of grapes that were missing harvested on its own. So therefore, if you take that small amount, not in context of a larger field, you're paying top dollar. That's what I'm saying. But they're both accounted for at the highest value. And those are the opinions of different Rishonim on Rabbi Yehoshua. This is not Rabbi Yehoshua.
So Damon, this is fair.
Yeah.
So this is the same thing you said earlier with the thing where you got to compare the land to 1/60th. 60 times the size because it's a wholesale, not a retail price. You do it's a similar concept on this one as well, where yes. It's between a little piece of a third of a vineyard compared to if you got 60 in a vineyard and one piece is missing, it's not the same value because it's wholesale.
Yes. And what I'm saying is here we haven't established, yes, but there's one difference. Here we haven't established if you apply the principle of 1 in 60 or just within the plot of land itself. But let's just minus, Kevin, the issue of 160. And we say, listen, you've got a single base hour, not 60 base hours, or a single base tuck, and a certain amount of the vineyard is missing. it's still going to cost the damager less, even if you account it in its ripened state, compared to if you just take that amount of grapes that were damaged at almost the wholesale value compared to the value within the greater vineyard context, even if it's a small vineyard. So what we're saying is Rabbi Yehoshua is working out as though the grapes were ready to be picked. But that term ready to be picked, we want to know, does it mean within and of itself in terms of market-related view, or because remember then you didn't take it to a wholesaler, you buy it at the market. So you were paying almost like, there wasn't a wholesaler, you were paying like retail prices. So since you were paying retail prices anyway, it's that versus if you're paying the fee for ripened grapes of the devastated loss within a certain context of a small field, not a bigger 60 times a base year, but within the base year itself. But we see it in its matured state. But Rabbi Yose HaGlili is different. He was talking about grain. So we're saying it seems as though Rabbi Yehoshua is talking about the fact that even though they were budding grapes, it doesn't matter if some of we don't wait to see if the vineyard has come to fruition or not. We pay as if the grapes were ready to be picked and they were ripe. But Rav Yose said we wait. We see how the rest of the field turned out before we assess the value of the grain. Okay, but Rav Yehoshua doesn't. So what we're saying is, do they disagree? In other words, one saying you have to wait until we see what happens in the big picture, and basically Rabbi Yehoshua is saying no. Even if bismadar, in other words, budding grapes, you see it in maturity, and the value is what it is at that point. Whether you assess it in terms of the larger field, as some of the Rishonim say, or whether it's market, they're still fully mature. You don't wait and see if the rest of the vineyard would reach maturity and if it would be attacked by, sometimes there's a mold, doesn't get hit by locusts, but there's a mold or a drought or whatever the case may be. So we're saying, does Rav Yose HaGlili and Rabbi Yehoshua disagree? And they're saying not necessarily, because if you look at some of the commentaries, like for example in the Shlomo or the Rashba or Tosfot, they might agree in a field of grain. Why? Because a field of grain, generally what happens to one side of the grain field will happen to the rest of the grain field. In other words, if there's some sort of crop disease, it's infectious. If there's some sort of locust spell, etc., it's infectious. Okay? In other words, locusts won't come and only eat in one area. They'll devastate the field, or there will be drought and it'll affect the whole field. Grapes are different. So it's saying that they don't necessarily disagree. Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Yose might agree in a case when it comes to the grain that you wait for the whole field. It doesn't mean that Rabbi Yehoshua disagrees with Rav Yose HaGlili. He's just saying when it comes to grapes, even if some of the vineyard doesn't come to fruition and some does, you can't make an opinion based on the future condition, because it doesn't mean that all the areas are affected. In other words, grapes don't work like grain, whereby if the entire vineyard will become infected, it will affect everything else. It means that you can take each part of the vineyard as its own separate entity. It doesn't devastate it on a macro level. Do you understand what I'm saying, guys? Yes or no? If you don't, well, give it back to me.
It's concentrated. Only a grape size crop can damage, doesn't affect the whole crop.
Correct.
You're saying.
Correct. So in other words, it doesn't mean that Rav Yose HaGlili turns around and argues with Rabbi Yehoshua, because Rabbi Yehoshua says, look, I don't care if it's in the stage of smada, if it's in budding grapes. You pay as though they ripened. And the only argument is, do you pay market value, in other words, just that area of damage, and market value is top dollar, or do you say that area is seen in the vineyard of fully developed grapes, and you still pay a lot, but just minus the devastation of that field and what that devastation loss would have been worth, which is still less than just picking it up for market, but far more than grapes that have not reached maturity. So the issue is that they both agree that you judge it based on maturity. The only difference is that Rav Yose HaGlili says that you have to wait till the field has ready to be harvested to assess the quality of the grain, whereas Rav Yehoshua says no, you take it as though it's already been ripened. And it doesn't mean they disagree, because what we're saying is it might be that they agree, but that grain and vineyards develop differently. In other words, if there's a pestilence or a drought, all the grain is damaged, whereas in a vineyard, some could be affected and some could not. That's all we say. All right, let's move on. In any event, the sages don't agree. What did they say? We view how much the land was worth before the damage occurred and how much it was worth afterwards, and the damager pays the difference. In other words, he pays the amount which the land was devalued when the budding grapes were damaged. In other words, the sages treat the damager more leniently than Rabbi Yehoshua does. So Rashi is basically saying that they look at it as budding grapes, not as fully developed grapes, the sages. Now, according to the sages, the damaged grapes are not evaluated on their own, but as part of the land. The next Tana disagrees, ruling that this method of assessment applies in more limited circumstances. So Rab Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rav Shimon, okay, in what case were the words, namely that the damaged produce is evaluated with the land stated, where the animal ate shoots or grapevines or shoots of fig trees? So what do we mean? Is that you've got this term, which was basically, how do we put it? Is that there's a next stage, there's the previous stage to smother. So smother is budding. At the earlier stage, the only thing you see is the shoots of grapevines, okay? So the grape cluster is discernible but not sufficiently developed for the individual grapes to be defined as fruit. So it's only at the stage of smother that you can see each individual grape, even though it's just budding, and that's in Brachos 36b. The similar growths on fig trees are Yechurim, okay? And if those shoots were damaged, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda would agree that the damager only pays for the depreciation of the land. So what he's saying is that basically, do you remember in the Mishnah it talks about what Rabbi Shimon said? He said, if it was ripened produce and you damaged the se'ah, you pay for a se'ah. If it damaged 2 base se'ah, you pay for 2 base se'ah. So this is Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda quoting in the name of Rabbi Shimon. So he's saying the only time that you evaluate it in context with the land is when it's in this preliminary stage of development, meaning it hasn't even developed buds yet. You only have like shoots of grapevines or shoots of fig trees. The minute it reaches the smother stage, which is even more strict than Rav Yehoshua or Rav Yose HaGlili, was certainly more than Rav Yehoshua, because Rav Yehoshua talks about budding grapes. So what we're saying is, if you look at Shimon ben Yehuda in the name of Shimon, he's saying no. The minute it reaches budding grapes already, it's judged at maturity. The only time that you can see it as non-maturity, in other words, in greater context of the land, is when you just see green shoots. That is when it's damaged. In that case, it's in context to the bigger field. But the minute it's reached a little bit of stage of development, like budding grapes, you can already say it's independent of the field. Does that make sense?
It's a separate entity.
It's
a separate entity. Yeah.
Correct. So he's actually much more stringent even than Rabbi Yehoshua. So, but if it ate half-ripe figs or half-ripe grapes, we view them as though they were grapes or figs ready to be picked. So in other words, that next stage after smother is boser. So boseh or grapes that have reached the size of white beans. In other words, they're not only discernible at that stage, but they're more advanced than smother. They meet the legal definition of fruit. Okay? And then you pay the price of what they'd cost in the market after being harvested. But obviously, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda states the law for shoots of grapevines. So those shoots are known as lulavei gefanim and half-ripe grapes. But he omits the intermediate stage of budding grapes. Okay, so Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda sees there's only two stages from what we've seen so far. Either it's fully developed, okay, or what happens is it's completely unripe. He hasn't gone to that middle stage. Does that make sense? So we're going to see what his opinion is as far as that's concerned. Okay, so who deals with the stage of smother? It's only Rabbi Yehoshua, but Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda hasn't dealt with that stage yet. Okay, so obviously Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda disagrees with our Mishnah. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon's opinion in our Mishnah states that only if it's fully ripe do you pay for ripe produce, such as boseh, but not if it's partially ripe. Does that make sense, guys? Whereas the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda explaining Rabbi Shimon is saying if it's partially ripe, we see it as ripe. Whereas our Mishnah says, Rabbi Shimon says, if it's ripe, you pay as if it's ripe. So that's a dissenting opinion. But either way, it doesn't matter, because we're saying now let's go to the broader context. The buyer derives his proof from the Brisa. In any event, the Brisa states in its two last cases, but the sages say we view how much the land was worth before the damage occurred and how much it's worth afterwards. And it does not say that the devastated area is assessed in a relation to 60 times larger, Kevin, 60 times larger. Although this is indeed the law with respect to damages done by one animal. What then must you say? You are compelled to concede, regardless of the Brisa's omission at this point, we still assess the devastated area in relation to a field 60 times larger. So then here as well, in the case of a person who did damage with his own hands, although the Brisa first omitted this law, we assess the devastated area in relation to a field 60 times larger. So what we're saying is as follows, is that this is the buyer's proof against Rava, because he's saying, look, even when it talks about a person doing damage to his fellow's budding grapes, okay, it doesn't mention in a field 60 times larger. And then in the case where the animal does damage to developing trees, the fact that it pays 2 ma'os for the first year tree or 4 ma'os for the second year tree means it's not seen in context of a larger damage. But we know the halacha, and we know the halacha is contradicting that, because the halacha, turns out, is that you work it out times 60. Whichever the ones you do, whether it's man that does the damage or animals, the halacha is you times it by 60. And neither of these brises actually are specific about seeing the plot of land in relation to a field or the damage 1 in 60. So he's saying to Rava, this isn't the proof. Because we know, in fact, when an animal does damage or a person does damage, that this would be the law. So that's no proof just because it's not mentioned at this particular point. Now, let's see, we've got 4 minutes left. Let me just see something. All right, I don't want to go into